So we're going to begin with the poem Benediction on page 105. And what I want to do is to continue our discussion from last time about beat politics. What are the politics of this poem? And we're going to talk specifically about this poem in a little more depth. If you remember last time we talked about how the beat poets were criticizing suburbia and consumerism and various aspects of America and the American dream after World War II. But when we look at Bob Kaufman's poem Benediction, I think we're going to see a little bit more serious and deeper kind of political argument being made or political critique. Okay, so what are some of the... In fact, let's start with, at the bottom of it, we get a critique that's very similar to what we've seen in Ferlinghetti's poetry, the third and fourth from the end lines. Every day your people get more and more cars, television, sickness, death dreams. Okay? Now the term death dreams strikes us as a little stronger than Ferlinghetti simply saying the immigrant stream in America has been mislaid among the sunbathers, you know, sort of it's gone astray. Hollywood, California has become a kind of suburban consumer society. But what is maybe Kaufman getting at by using a stronger term like death dreams? What might he mean by it?
I kind of thought of it as going back almost to alienation. People are getting so similar, everything's becoming the same that they're tired of life because it's meaningless.
Okay, yeah. So that life... Alienation, in a strong sense of it, implies that we're dead, right? We've become kind of dead to ourselves. And maybe what he's saying is that people are living kind of dead lives, right? What else might he be meaning with this phrase or the poem as a whole? He certainly could be talking about the American dream being dead, or being built on the kind of alienation, dead to yourself sort of sensibility we just talked about. Because the critique of kind of the American dream is sort of at the heart of the beat critique, but it's a death dream rather than a living, vital dream. But what are some of the other parts of the poem that we can connect to? Let's start with the first verse. Pale brown Moses went down to Egypt land to let somebody's people go. Keep them out of Florida. No UN there. What's he talking about? Or if you want it even stronger, the next line, the next verse begins, America, I forgive you, nailing black Jesus to an imported cross every 6 weeks in Dawson, Georgia. He's certainly talking about race, but what's he criticizing about race in America? Yeah.
It's all sold out. It's like people keep trying to use it for money almost, and just abuse the power that it gives.
Okay. The economics of race in America.
He's almost saying that the Americans are hypocritical.
Yeah.
Their Jesus, their God was black, or the pale brown, and now they're nailing black people to crosses. They can't go to Florida or Georgia because of it.
So there's segregation. You know, they can't be treated equally in Florida. But there's also sort of the KKK. You know, that people are literally being nailed to crosses, right? And that's where you see that Bob Kaufman is raising much more serious issues than Lawrence Ferlinghetti. Ferlinghetti talked about problems in America, but he wasn't talking about the KKK and black people literally being killed. We also saw this in Bob Kaufman's other poem about war and, you know, the slaughter of Japanese people with the atom bomb, and he raises that issue, which is a bigger issue than a lot of Ferlinghetti's poetry tries to deal with. And he says this here towards the bottom of 105. His descendants are experts in real estate. Your generals have mushrooming visions. So again, he's critiquing the Cold War and the nuclear weapons race. Criticizing real estate and suburban homes and stuff like that. That's more like Ferlinghetti. But here you can see when we put all these issues together, Kaufman is really creating a much more substantial poem with a little more political punch to it. Okay? Just like Public Enemy has a more politically engaged form of art than T.S. Eliot did. A similar kind of difference. But then let's go to the final punchline. You must have been great alive. What's that sort of final stab he's making at America there?
And it seems like in the realization of the American dream, it killed itself. So it sounds like he's saying, in theory, the American dream is a beautiful thing, but in practice it isn't.
Yeah, and especially where he puts that right after every day your people get more and more, which again seems like the positive side of the American dream. He's saying maybe that American dream will kill America, right? So part of what's going on here then is a critique of the U.S., of America as a nation. And this is particularly important because this is the height of the Cold War, where Americans generally felt like they had saved the world for democracy, and that America was the center to producing prosperity and peace and good things for the world as a whole. And here is Bob Kaufman sort of sticking a dagger in that and saying, you know, the American dream, the American view of freedom, of racial equality, even of consumerism, are all dead-end dreams, okay? And kind of criticizes them, okay? So does that make sense? This poem really isn't any different than the poems we analyzed before. It's just the apotheosis, the climax, the kind of stronger form of those poems kind of all wrapped together with all their critiques crammed into one poem. But it's a great example of what we mean by the beat critique of politics in America. Okay? Any questions on that? Does that make sense? It's a little bit straightforward. Okay. What I want to turn to now is we're going to start to talk about beat poetics. And the Beats weren't the only people after World War II making new kinds of art. Just like modernists weren't the only kinds of artists in the first half of the 20th century. But so that we could look a little bit more in detail, we're just going to focus on one, and we're just going to talk about the Beat generation. And Bob Kaufman, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, and Allen Ginsberg, who we'll read, are all examples of Beat writers. Okay? So, as we turn from politics to art, we want to look at the poetics, or the art of the Beats, and what are they doing artistically to express their critique of American politics? Okay? So again, we could start with the poem on 94 and 95, O Jazzo War Memoir, and we talked about how the first half of that poem, or at least the bottom half of page 94, was a critique of the Cold War and patriotic militarism, and even of World War II in some ways, the atom bomb. The poem is about turning to jazz as a way out of those problems. The solution to the Cold War for Bob Kaufman isn't necessarily a question of, weapons and disarmament, as it is a cultural question of turning to jazz music. And a lot of Lawrence Ferlinghetti's poems also will talk about art as being a central part of the Beat vision. So we could look at page 22 in Ferlinghetti's book. It's kind of a simple poem. It's number 9. It was like this when we waltz into this place, a couple of far-out cats doing an Aztec two-step. Let's cut up, but this dame comes up behind me, and says, you and me could really exist, but the next day she has bad teeth and really hates poetry. And the punchline there is really hates poetry. Ferlinghetti probably could overlook her bad teeth, but it's a deal breaker that she doesn't like poetry. And it's just a simple poem that shows you how important poetry and jazz and music and culture are to the Beat Generation writers. They really believed that poetry and art was going to change the world. If we look on page 28, on page 28, this is poem 13. Not like Dante discovering a commedia upon the slopes of heaven, I would paint a different kind of paradise. So, not with angels telling you, what to do in heaven, or hellfires, nor any altars in the sky, this is at the end, except fountains of imagination. Okay? So for him, his view of paradise is a world of art, a world of the imagination, not a world of, Christianity and good and evil and those kinds of things. Okay? And to go a little bit farther into the Beat's definition of poetry, I don't know. Most poets want to be new and different, but there's a little bit of a difference between how the modernist poets tried to be shockingly new and how the Beat poets tried to be new. And you can see in the next poem, number 14 on page 29, it says, don't let that horse eat that violin, cried Chagall's mother, but he kept right on painting. So he's praising Chagall, who would paint horses eating violins and strange roosters and just odd combinations of things that don't make realistic sense. And he's praising that power of the imagination to imagine things that are far out, things that are different, things that are new. And we'll talk more and get a little bit more into what really is different about this Beat sensibility. But it starts off with modernism, because Chagall is a modernist painter who's painting things shockingly new, and that's what Ferlinghetti is going to praise in his poetry. Okay? Let's turn now to 30, and 31. These are probably two of Ferlinghetti's more important poems. In poem 15 on page 30, he talks about the poet as an acrobat who's constantly risking absurdity and death, performing above the heads of his audience. He climbs on rhyme to a high wire of his own making. Okay? And most of the imagery throughout the rest of that poem has to do with a poet taking chances. Okay? What are the beats saying, though, or Ferlinghetti in particular, when he's saying an artist needs to risk absurdity? Or later on needs to do sleight of foot tricks and other high theatrics, performing on the high wire of art. What sense of art is he trying to present us with here? Why might he feel that the artist needs to take chances? What?
To get people's attention.
Okay. Maybe part of it's just to do something new and daring, like the modernists, but maybe it's also to get attention, right? You have to do something that stands out. And maybe increasingly so in a world of television and radio, that poets had to do more exceptional kinds of things to get noticed with all the other kinds of culture being produced. But there's maybe a more important beat reference at the bottom of page 30, who may or may not catch her fair eternal form, spread-eagled in the empty air of existence. One of the things the Beats wanted to do was basically stand naked before the world. They were called confessional poets. T.S. Eliot didn't really let us inside his personal life. He wrote poetry that was important and it had important things to say. But even if we look at the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock as sort of revealing something of his own inner insecurities, it's not a personal poem. It's not T.S. Eliot speaking from the heart and telling you really what his life is all about. One of the big changes in the Beat generation was they wanted to stand spread-eagled before the world and really express their true, honest emotions, warts and all. Now, Allen Ginsberg literally would do poetry readings naked, literally bearing his body and his soul to the audience. But that was kind of a symbol of the kind of thing that the Beat generation was about. And we can see another example of this if we look at Bob Kaufman. Well, we can start with 110, which we already talked about. At the very end of that, the next to last stanza, Rousseau shouted poetry from his window on that mad world, right? That they wanted to shout their poetry from the rooftops. And he expresses this more fully in a poem on page 55 called Picasso's Balcony. If you just look a couple lines down into the poem, yet swallowing events of 1,000 nights of dying and loving all blue, gone to that tomb hidden in cubic air, breathing sounds of sorrow, crying love rising, wailing, sobbing, breathing uneven sounds of sorrow. And if you go all the way down to the bottom, stringing hours together in thin melodic lines, wrapped around the pearl neck of morning, beneath the laughter of sad seabirds, right? This is a poem that's all about emotion, about joy, about laughter, about sadness. The beat poets are less concerned with dazzling you with their brilliance and their intelligence than they are about having you feel the intense emotions that they're trying to express in their poetry. Okay? So let's look at two examples and start with Lawrence Ferlinghetti, pages 44 through 46. This is basically his retelling of the end of Ulysses. And if you remember the page we had with the last page of Ulysses, some of the things you'll even notice are common references. At the bottom of page 45, about 6 lines up, yes as in a night maze, yes, I said, yes, I will. And he called me his Andalusian rose, and I said, yes, my heart was going like mad. And that's the way Ulysses ends, as everything always ends. Okay? So, what's different about his retelling of Ulysses from what we read? There's similar references to saying yes, and the Andalusian rose, and this is the way things end. They're both about sexuality. But what's different about the way that that Ferlinghetti tells it? And let's kind of go through a couple lines. And that's the way, from the beginning, it always is, and that's the way it always ends. And the fire and the rose are one, and always the same scene, and always the same subject. Okay? Now, the fire and the rose are one is actually a reference to a T.S. Eliot poem, The Four Quartets. But what's the style of language that Ferlinghetti is using in that passage? He throws the phrase fire and rose are one in there, but not like T.S. Eliot to make some profound allusion to the literary tradition. He kind of throws it in there offhandedly. How about just the phrase, always the same scene? How would you describe that use of language if somebody used that phrase?
It's like history repeating itself.
Well, he is talking about history repeating itself. And specifically, he's talking about love, you know, that in the end people always fall in love, and it's always a cycle of falling in and out of love. But just the words, the word choice, it's always the same scene. What kinds of words is he using there? Or let's go down about 10 or 15 lines. It looks like all they ever think of is doing it, and it doesn't matter much with who half the time, and the other half it matters more than anything. Oh, the sweet love fevers, yes, and there's always complications like maybe she has no eyes for him, or him no eyes for her, or her no eyes for her, or him no eyes for him. What can you say about the style of his language? And you might even think back to the difference from the Ulysses passage, if you remember it. It looks like all they ever think of is doing it. Right? Is that elevated, fancy language, or just common, colloquial, everyday English? Just like when he says, it's always the same scene. Okay? That's a colloquial way of saying things. And what the Beat generation, since they wanted to express emotion, not show you how smart they were, they tried to use as much as possible ordinary language. Okay. There's even some stream of consciousness. He's just letting his thoughts evolve, but it's very ordinary stream of consciousness. He's talking just like an ordinary person, rather than talking like a really sophisticated writer. So when we talked about congenial art, if you were to take this poem and put it side by side with the page from Ulysses by James Joyce that I gave you, you would see how this poem is much more congenial. It's in more ordinary language. Everybody can relate to it. It's not trying to sort of overwhelm you with its intelligence and, you know, complex vocabulary and complex writing style. He's just trying to sort of tell the story that people fall in love. Okay? Let's look at one more example, which is a little bit trickier, but it comes from Kaufman, page 80. Okay? This looks like a modernist poem. The radio is teaching my goldfish jujitsu. It's strange, it's odd combinations of things, mixed up images like you might find in T.S. Eliot. But what's different about it? You would never find that particular line in a T.S. Eliot poem. And why not? What?
It's too common.
Yeah, it's common. What else is it?
Below.
What?
It's below T.S. Eliot.
Yeah, it's ordinary. It's comic. It's not serious and profound. Okay? How about going down about 10 lines? I went to a masquerade disguised as myself, not one of my friends recognized. Okay? Again, how's that different from T.S. Eliot? He would have never said that.
We would have said the same thing, only you get to think about it. You'd have to know a reference to what he's saying in order to get.
I wear a mask of my face by you know, I keep it by the door or whatever, and I have to think and rethink whenever I try to do anything because I'm afraid or whatever, right? Here it's funny, he comes right out and says it, he uses ordinary words. It's still clever, it's still kind of mixed up ideas. What does that really mean if you go disguised as yourself? You have to think about what that means, just like you do with T.S. Eliot's Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, but it's doing it in a much more congenial way, a much more likable way, a much more friendly way to get at it. Let's just look at one more, well, two more, about 10 lines up from the end. The search for the end of the circle is the constant occupation of squares. Okay, he's making a critique of square America, but what's he saying about them? How's he making that criticism?
They're just going around in never-ending circles, not really ever finding an end.
Yeah, and you don't need to look up in a dictionary the footnote, and you know there's not the same complexity to it. If T.S. Eliot was going to make the same criticism, he'd use much less obvious and direct language. Okay, but about 10 lines down from the top on 81, television, America's ultimate relief from the Indian disturbance. Okay, now that's a pretty profound line. What's he saying about television to begin with?
It makes you forget about like everything else. It's a distraction.
Yeah, it's a distraction. and to forget especially about important things or things you don't want to think about, right? And what's it saying about the Indian disturbance? What's he saying about America and American history there?
He's poking fun at the belief that the Indians were an inconvenience for white people.
Yeah, he's turning that story of America around again, right? And he's saying, you know, who's the real American here, right? That maybe it's not them disturbing us, maybe we disturb them. But again, you can see it's a funny line. It's said in a straightforward sort of way. Sure, you kind of have to think about it, but it's not like a T.S. Eliot poem. Okay? And so, I want to go over again two phrases. One is congeniality. And the other is poplore. Okay? And congeniality, what we mean by congeniality is it's kind of a modernist form of art, but it's changed profoundly. There's still fragmented, mixed up images, there's still stream of consciousness, there's still a desire to be shockingly new, but it reaches out to the audience and their desires rather than just trying to write a poem for intellectuals and libraries and bookstores. Okay? It tries to connect to its audience. And it's friendlier with ordinary language, real human emotions. All the things we've been talking about are examples of how beat poetry became more congenial than modernism had been before it. Okay? Maybe this could be a more complex idea, but poplore is basically folklore in a modern world. Okay? So how does folklore change in a modern world? How many of you folk dance? Not a lot. How many of you know folk tales of your people that you pass on in oral form and tell from generation to generation? Right? So what we normally think of as folklore, it's oral culture, oral traditions. It's like traditions stuck in the past. It usually belongs to rural people, less developed people. We still have folklore, but it's changed completely. And what are some of the things that have changed it? What's different about your culture today from the folklore culture of people living in Montana 100 years ago?
Access to media.
Okay, so media is one of the very most important ones. Okay? Beginning in the first half of the 20th century and rapidly extending in the second half of the 20th century, folklore all gets passed down through media, through recordings of music, through television, and that totally changes how it's understood. So that The Simpsons today, or other TV shows, Breaking Bad, I don't know, are folklore, the stories that we tell each other. It's just they come through the media rather than being handed down, you know, from person to person. Right? So think about the blues. The blues and jazz were once folklore, for folk music. But at the beginning of the 1920s or so, the blues and jazz start to become recorded, and by the 1950s, you know, most of the important forms of music are recorded through the media now. What's another thing that's changed in people's ordinary culture today?
Access to knowledge.
Okay.
The internet, immediate access to knowledge.
Okay, and the internet is really just the extreme form of media, right? That we access things through, not just normal media, but sort of hyper internet media as well. Right? Another important change is it's urban. For the most part, our culture comes from cities and spreads out to Montana. There's very few, you know, major American music acts that come from rural places like Montana anymore, you know, outside of maybe country music. Okay? So that's a change. And another is it's an individualized, and I'm going to call this the star system. The blues in the 1850s, anybody could play the same song and they passed it down from person to person. Today, a blues musician is a star who has their name put on their music and it's identified with them as an individual. Okay? So all those things have changed the way that popular culture is passed on. Okay? And this also has to do with what we talked about the other day about pop culture. Another way to think about this is that pop lore is modern pop culture. And these two forces of congeniality and pop lore are converging. Modernism is reinventing itself in more congenial ways, and it's mixing with pop lore so that the pop lore of jazz music and the new beat poetry are crossing paths in ways that Eliot's poetry wasn't influenced by popular culture in the same way. Okay? So I'm just going to start through a handful of slides that we'll talk about more next time when we talk about jazz in particular. So you could think about this jazz music as either a form of pop lore, folk jazz music that becomes developed and more developed through the recording industry into an art form, or you can think of it as a kind of congenial modernism, that this was an art form of complex jazz music, but as you can see here, this isn't John Cage's 4 Minutes of Silence. This is something you would enjoy and that would reach out to an audience and make an emotional connection to them. Okay? This we already talked about. Okay, so this is what we just went over, but just to reiterate, the use of contemporary lore is like folklore, but it's done by stars, by individuals who are identifiable. it's done in the city, and it's done with cameras and electric instruments, TVs and radios and records, which turns it into pop lore instead of folklore. Think of dancing the same way. Dancing with rock music and rap music and popular music is just our form of folk dancing. It's just been influenced by popular media. Okay? When we talk about congeniality, this is Ornette Coleman, who had a song named Congeniality that W.T. Lamone uses for his idea of congeniality. He says, I thought of how a musician feels towards an audience. What united him with his public and the focus on his audience is one of the ways to think about how modernism and poetry in particular are changing as people reach out to the audiences rather than just the artistic form itself. And this is the epical change that's going on in modernism. It's a profound change, as profound as modernism itself was from what came before it. Okay, so the first thing that we'll talk about, and I think this is what we'll start with today, is the idea of speed and acceleration. That when you had modern technology, radios and television, culture sped up tremendously because you were able to produce new kinds of cultural forms. And one of these can be seen in jazz. Jazz after World War II was basically twice as fast as jazz before World War II. So here's a typical jazz song. Swing jazz from the 20s and the time of the Great Gatsby. This next song is actually the exact same song, but it's played in new ways. But it's the same chord changes. And one of the differences is just obviously how fast it is. Right? Think about how much rock and roll sped up how much is that doggy in the window type music. It changed popular music. So because the world was changing and cities and people were changing, art cultures got speedier in style, delivery, and cycles. Everything about culture sped up. So this is Jack Kerouac's On the Road, which is a novel about just zooming across the Western Plains as fast as possible. At the bottom, because there was nowhere to go but everywhere, just keep rolling under the stars, generally the Western stars. Or it's about Dean Moriarty, which is the hero of the novel, who started Jack Kerouac's life on the road. Dean was born on the road when his parents were passing through Salt Lake City. And Dean was the type of guy who just raced in society. So the heroes, the novels, stories that people were telling were about speed and speeding up the world. And we'll stop with this. But this is just his description of Dean Moriarty as a parking lot attendant in New York City. He's the most fantastic parking lot attendant. He could back a car 40 miles an hour into a tight squeeze, stop at the wall, jump out, race among fenders, leap into another car, circle at 50 miles an hour in a narrow space, back swiftly into a tight spot, hump, snap the car with the emergency so that you can see it bounce as he flies out. Then blah, 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 blah. This is just one paragraph. But you can see that he values this hero Dean because he's a fast person who speeds through life. But also Kerouac's writing style is just bam, 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 bam. So that the style of culture changed as did the theme of people being interested in things going faster. Okay? So we'll follow up later. That's good enough for today.